First of all, I want to say how deeply honored I am to have been invited here to Spring Hill. I lived in Alabama for 8 years. I still consider it sweet home Alabama. I was so happy last night when I got off the plane from Burlington, Vermont, and felt that warm, humid air and heard a killdeer, a bird that just probably left Vermont, and now it's down here on the Gulf Coast. So there's something else I have in common with all of you. I realized today in the cafeteria when I saw the word badgers. I just spent 8 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison getting a Ph.D. in environmental studies, and guess what our mascot is? The badgers, right. So I really love badgers, and you all are also badgers. I've never been at another school that had the badgers as their mascot. So I lived in Alabama for 8 years. I fell in love in Montgomery. I met my husband, who was from New York, and we got married on a pontoon boat in the middle of the Alabama River, so I have some Alabama roots. And I want to thank Dr. Fox for bringing me back here to speak, and Carolyn Simmons also, who's not here, and Karen Ross for helping to arrange the talk and my travel. I met Dr. Fox and Dr. Simmons a couple of years ago at a conference in Auburn, and they gave an amazing presentation on the work that some of you maybe have done in Mobile schools teaching science. I was greatly inspired by their presentation, went to talk to them afterwards, and we've been talking to each other ever since because I do similar work. Have any of you here been in these classes and worked in the schools with? Great. I hope to hear from you later. All right, so I also would like to thank Father Rhymes. I know he's not with us anymore, but I read a little bit about his life, and I loved one of the statements he made that he said, quote, "College is all about teaching," and I quite agree with him because I love to teach. So I want to say I'm grateful to the undergraduates who are here tonight because I don't know about Spring Hill, but I teach at the University of Vermont, and we're at the point where my undergraduates are coming to school really stressed out, right? They've just taken a lot of exams, they've written papers. How many of you are feeling stressed out right now? You're just counting the days till Thanksgiving. Okay, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. So just a second here, let me type this in. Here we go. Who knows? Does anyone know Frosty the Dancing Parrot? Let's see, how can we turn this up? Let me get some volume here. Let's see. Volume. There we go. Yeah. I turn it up. All right. Okay, goodbye, Frosty. Let's see. Okay, so this is the time of the semester where I like to start my lectures with Frosty the Dancing Parrot as my teaching assistant. That's why, because he makes us all laugh. All right, so my very crooked and windy path towards vocational discernment that I'm going to talk about tonight, and that's the teaching them how to fly, a feathered perspective on vocational discernment. My path weaves through the social and the natural sciences and a quest for justice. And it all began with a Jesuit mentor. So this is my Jesuit mentor. He died in September of 2003 of brain cancer. His name was Father Javier Gorostiaga. Have any of you ever heard of him? No. Well, he was a truly remarkable man. I want to talk about him a little bit tonight just because my path was greatly influenced by a Jesuit. He was born into a political Basque family in Spain during Franco's dictatorship. After fighting that dictatorship as a young priest, he later went to Latin America, and he became a champion of poor people's struggles for justice. He was an economist, and he was also a liberation theology theorist and practitioner. And liberation theology has had a great influence on my life. And I was very pleased to hear today that you are required to take 3 theology courses here at Spring Hill. So I'd like some of our smart students to explain what liberation theology is. So I don't have to define it. Somebody want to try that? Do you all know what liberation theology is? No? Okay, all right. Well, simply, it's the idea or the thought or the belief system that the poor shouldn't have to wait for justice in heaven, that they should be able to have a better life here on earth. And it was a way of thinking very influential in Latin America. And Javier was part of a group of Jesuits who went to Central America, and they worked with people who were trying to overthrow US-backed military dictatorships. In fact, some of Javier's Jesuit brothers were murdered by the Salvadoran military in San Salvador. He was from that same group of priests. He was also a planning minister for the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, excuse me, and also an architect of the Panama Canal Treaty, which returned the canal to Panama. Believe it or not, that project began in part as his dissertation at Cambridge University. So he did a lot of incredible things. He was also a pioneer in poverty research. He set up a network of economic research institutes in Latin America to study poverty in countries where very few people gathered statistics on poverty. So because of this Jesuit mentor, I have shaken hands with presidents, I've interrogated defense ministers, I've written under a pen name and published books and hundreds of articles in English and Spanish. And even more importantly, I feel I've been able to make at least a small difference as an investigative journalist and a citizen. But here's a word of warning to undergraduates, those of you who study with Jesuits. Because of Javier, I've also contracted malaria, I suffered through years of amoebic dysentery, I survived 2 of the hemisphere's worst hurricanes, and I nearly got killed on a couple of occasions. So be careful if you study with Jesuits. But I want to dedicate this presentation tonight on vocational discernment to him because years ago he inspired young people like me all over the world. He poured gasoline on us and he set us on fire. And I know that wherever his students are today, we still try to honor his example with our work to love and to serve in the Ignatian tradition. So this is a photograph of me in the 1990s in Guatemala. I was working for the United Nations. That's why I'm wearing a blue uniform. And you can see my boots are covered with mud. And my job was to walk from village to village. We had to walk. There were no roads. Gathering information about massacres that had been committed by the Guatemalan military in the 1980s. And there were a lot of mass graves in Guatemala, and there still are. So I want to tell you how I got here and how I met Javier. So my path to Central America began with a favorite professor in college, some aspirin and some orange juice. That's what this story is about. I was a young student just like you. I was at USC in Los Angeles, the University of Southern California, the Trojans football school. I was studying Spanish and Latin American studies, and I had a favorite professor. How many of you have a favorite professor? A few of you do. Okay. Right. Okay, so you want to stick close to your favorite professors, because some wonderful things can happen. So my favorite professor at that time was Dr. Nora Hamilton. She was a political scientist, and she taught a course on Central American history. And this is when I was learning about all these things. So this was in the mid-1980s. About 500,000 Salvadorans had left El Salvador because of the Civil War, and Nicaraguans as well, and Guatemalans, and many people ended up in Los Angeles, where I was going to school. And so because of this situation, Nora decided to organize a major conference at USC on the Central American Civil War situation. And because I was her pet student, I offered to help her. I volunteered with whatever she needed. And so she called me right before the conference, frantic, and said, Trish, one of our major speakers is this Spanish priest, and he's just flown in from Nicaragua, and he's staying downtown in a hotel, and he can't drive, and he doesn't have a car, and he's sick. He's got a terrible cold, and you have a car, and you speak Spanish. Will you go and see if he's okay, and see if he needs anything? So I was all excited on this urgent errand, and I got in my old Toyota Corolla, and I went and bought some aspirin and some orange juice. And I went downtown to the hotel, and I knocked on the door, and after about 30 seconds, the door opened, and this thin man in pajamas was standing there, a thin bearded man, and it was Javier. And that changed my life, and that's how I ended up in Central America. He offered me a job at his Economic Research Institute in Managua. So this is the first lesson in vocational discernment for students. Volunteer for stuff, okay? If your professor needs something, do it, because you just don't know where that will take you. But also remember to take malaria medicine. So, after 10 years, I left Central America. How many of you know where this is? Yes. Where? The Southern Poverty Law Center. Right. Next part of the story. So after 10 years, I left Central America. I was determined to bring some of the lessons that I learned from my Central American friends, bring those lessons home. And I was hired as a hate crimes researcher at Southern Poverty. I was there 2 years, actually, and then I worked for another outfit in Atlanta called the Center for Democratic Renewal. I love this photo, and I love this quote. Until justice rolls down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream, Martin Luther King Jr. So I got to walk past that quote every day on the way to work, kind of reminding me what is important. But this is the Civil Rights Memorial. While in Montgomery, this is how I fell into teaching, again, volunteering. I was asked to go to a women's prison in Wetumpka, Alabama, the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, as a volunteer writing teacher. And I began going there on Saturdays, and I discovered that I loved teaching. I'm an accidental teacher, a reluctant teacher. I had no intentions to teach, but in the prison, I just discovered that I loved it and that it was a way to make a difference in people's lives. And then I ended up going to teach journalism at Auburn University. But during all these years of researching, writing, and teaching, believe it or not, I never cared about birds. I mean, I didn't have anything against them. The truth is, I just never paid any attention to them. My attitude was sort of birds, schmerds, right? I mean, the only species I cared about was Homo sapiens. And if you think about what I'm doing today, that's pretty incredible. But then after I had taught at Auburn for, I think, 4 or 5 years, I got offered a job teaching journalism at Loyola University in New Orleans. Now, Javier had just died the year before in Spain, and when this phone call came to my home in Montgomery offering me a job at Loyola, I thought, wow, this is like going home, returning to the Jesuit fold. I thought, this is meant to be. Except, of course, it wasn't meant to be. So I'm not going to bore everyone here, because you live in hurricane country and you know more about this than I do, about what happened on August 29, 2005 when Katrina hit us. You know because you took us in, and thank you for that. You've all experienced this yourselves, and I know there are students here from Louisiana. But I put this photo up there. That's me in my home. I lived in Lakeview, which indeed does have a lake view, which of course was unfortunate during the hurricane. Too much of a lake view, so we had water in the house 11.5 feet for 3 weeks. and everything was destroyed. So as I stood there that day in my home, this was 40 days after the hurricane, trying to breathe through a mask, I realized, how is this possible? I have 2 master's degrees in social science. I've published 2 books, but I have absolutely no clue how to live on this planet without destroying it. And I started thinking about that and my total lack of environmental knowledge, my total lack of environmental consciousness. Again, I didn't care about other species, and I began to reflect on it. And then I started thinking about when I lived in Central America in the 1980s and 1990s, campesinos, small farmers, even back then, nobody talked about climate change or global warming, but people said, el clima está raro. The climate is weird, the weather is weird. And that's because the rainy seasons in Guatemala and Nicaragua were getting shorter. And when there's less rain and the rainy seasons are shorter, that means there's less of a growing season, which reduces people's food supply, which is very serious. And so now you have droughts and you have famine, serious famine in Guatemala, a couple million people starving. So people were already experiencing climate change. And I began to think about this right after Katrina as a matter of justice, but I didn't know anything about it. And so I decided to go back to school to get a Ph.D. in environmental studies. I was offered a research position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that paid for the Ph.D., so we moved to Madison. This is across the street from our new home in Madison that we moved to. It's a park. It's an urban wetland park called Warner Park. It's Madison, Wisconsin's 2nd largest city park. This is the wetland. You can see it also has woods, meadows, thickets. It's about 213 acres. What is this bird right here? Does anyone know? Great blue heron. Okay. The great blue herons of Madison and Vermont are already gone. They may be here right now on your beaches. So the birds tie us together. So we moved to a house across the street from this beautiful place. I'll just show you a couple of pictures of it real quick. That's the red fox of Warner Park. That's right across the street from where I lived. I'd look out the window and there would be the fox. These are Cecropian silk moths. They mated for 36 hours on that tree. The female's on top, right? The female's on top. She's the big fat one, see? And the male's underneath. And the longer, as they mate, he gets skinnier and skinnier. He just shrinks into nothing, and she becomes this big, huge, beautiful creature. Yes, it's true. I watched it. And that's the meadow. Woods. This is all the park right across the street. Very beautiful place. That's winter. That's what we're getting ready for now. And this is me. Okay, so the second lesson for vocational discernment for students, fall in love. This is what happened to me when I went to graduate school in Madison. As I told you before, I didn't care about birds. I'd never thought about them. But I moved to Madison, that's me sitting on the hill in the park, and I took an ornithology course. Do you have an ornithology course here at Spring Hill? No. I feel sorry for you. Very sorry for you. They have a wonderful course at UW-Madison. It's a pre-veterinary course, very, very hard. And I thought, why not? The birds, I'll just try this. I went off the deep end, all right? I ended up we were supposed to do our homework outside 1 hour a week. I ended up going into this park every day for hours and hours. I just didn't want to leave. Believe it or not, it became a dissertation. I ended up spending over 600 hours looking at birds in this park. So sometimes when I do things, I go a little bit too far. But this became a baseline survey in the park of birds. I found 141 species. It's now a citizen science survey involving kids, college students, and neighbors, and also Madison Audubon. And it became the basis for my dissertation. The other thing that I did was a geolocation monitoring study of gray catbirds. How many of you know what a gray catbird is? A couple of people. Well, you have them right now here, yes, in Mobile. I was out this morning. I heard them when I was walking around. Marvelous bird. It's a very funny bird because it imitates other birds. It can imitate a crying baby, and it imitates cats. It sounds like a cat. That's why it's called a catbird. So Warner Park had catbirds, and I read that these birds come down to the south and that they go to Central America. And I had one in my yard, and he was quite loud. I thought, is it possible that this bird in my backyard in Madison goes to the yard where I lived in Guatemala or goes to the yard where I lived in Montgomery? Could this bird tie me to all the places I have called home? Believe it or not, that became a research project that I'm now completing. And I did in fact find out that the gray catbirds of Warner Park actually do come down to the Gulf Coast, and then they go to the Yucatan and northern Guatemala. So that became part of my research. But the other thing I found out while I was doing this research, I started attending public meetings because I don't just care about birds. I wanted to know what was happening in my neighborhood. I started going to neighborhood association meetings. I started going to city council meetings and parks commission meetings. I wanted to tell people about the birds and how excited I was to live in Madison. And I started finding out when I told people about the birds, even city councilmen, that they didn't believe me. Because they said, Warner Park, they said, that's a swamp, that's a wasteland, that's a landfill. And they didn't believe that it could have such a high level of biodiversity. I also found out that Warner Park was, like a lot of places, it was a place of intense human use. There was a huge baseball stadium not far from my house. The largest fireworks show in the Midwest was held every year across the street from my house. The real estate agent neglected to mention that when we bought our home. There was a 32,000 square foot community center, also a 40-acre parking lot. So it's a place like many places, right, where there is intense human use and also wildlife use. But people weren't seeing the wildlife use. And I was very surprised because Madison is supposed to be an environmentally conscious city, right? So I wondered, what's going on? Why don't people see the birds and the wildlife? And then I was at a meeting one night and someone said, what do you think about this plan to develop Warner Park? And I said, what plan? They said, well, there's a major city plan to pave parts of the park, to put in a new parking lot, and to cut down a lot of the trees. So I went home very disturbed, and I got on the internet, and I found the plan. It was 165 pages. And it would have turned a bird nursery on a marsh island into a site for weddings. It would have paved parts of it, and people would have been renting it out for weddings, and it would have cut down some of the woods. So I was a little freaked out and thought, what can I do about this? And then at the same time that this was all happening, I discovered that Warner Park was in the middle of some of the worst inequity in Madison. So up on the right, you see on the northeast corridor, that's the park in the middle. This is an aerial photo. All this green space, and then you see the Marsh Island. But in the northeast corridor, 39% of my neighbors were African American, Latino, Filipino, Asian. The median income was $28,000, and only 10% of my neighbors had a college degree. There were also a ton of children living on the northeast corridor in apartment buildings without yards. So this park was like their yard. Now, if you took a bike and you rode across this side of the park, it was a neighborhood called Maple Bluffs, where the governor lives, Scott Walker, if you've heard of him. 98% of the neighbors are Caucasian or white, and the median income is $150,000, and 82% have a college degree. Now, that's an incredible amount of inequity in such a small place, with this gorgeous park sandwiched in between. And I lived right about here on the edge of all this. And so at these meetings, I began hearing about problems on the other side of the park, community leaders concerned about violence, gang shootings, violence in the park, and talking about latchkey kids, their parents working, 2 jobs, and the kids coming home and having nothing to do. And they said, there's no programs in the park. There's no education programs. There's no environmental programs. And so I started scratching my head thinking, okay, what can I do about this? And I began to see it as a matter of environmental justice. Now, environmental justice is defined as where we live, work, and play. And that is different from the environmental movement in general. So in the environmental movement in general, people think about wilderness areas. They're very important too. Don't get me wrong. But we tend to think of, oh, nature's out there. We get in our cars and we drive to the real wilderness. but we don't think of it as being where we live, like just outside this room and on your campus and in the city of Mobile. But the environmental justice movement was started by people in poorer communities, Louisiana, Cancer Alley, areas of Alabama, and other parts of the country where people said, we're living next to toxic waste dumps. And there was a project, an environmental project, a justice project on the highway between Montgomery and Selma. I don't know if you've heard of this. There was going to be a landfill there on the Civil Rights Trail. Has anyone heard of that? And there was a whole struggle to stop that, and people did stop it. They organized to stop having a dump on the same route as the Civil Rights Trail. Well, that was an environmental justice struggle. So I started thinking about Warner Park in those terms because people were complaining about the kids and saying these kids are getting into trouble, and city councilmen were telling me, well, these birds, what are they doing there anyway? Why don't they just go to a conservation park? That's literally what one city councilman said to me. So people were framing the birds as a problem and the kids as a problem. And I thought, well, if we put the two together, they won't be a problem, there'll be a solution. And so that's what I decided to do. And this became my dissertation. It was nesting in the city, birds, kids, and parks as teachers of urban ecology was what it was called. A community-based action research dissertation to save a place from development. I used 3 political interventions to do this project. It took 8 years. It's an ongoing project. There's now a community organization called Wild Warner. You can Google it. They're carrying on this work. I used citizen science research on birds, the environmental education program with kids, which is what I'm going to focus on right now, and community organizing. And these are the research methods that I used: participant observation and ethnography. I spent over 120 hours at public meetings, 6 years of community organizing, and 230 hours teaching in the park with college students and children. And then I did ornithological field research and community-based citizen science surveys. That was 600 hours in the park, and I talked about that before. Anybody know who that is? Glenda the Good Witch, yes. So I think at first I saw myself as kind of a Glenda the Good Witch with binoculars. And I say that because I'm from a very Irish Catholic family. My parents are both from Northern Ireland, and I was sort of raised, I was raised in Southern California, but with the mentality that you help the poor. So I had this very serious case of what is called white savior syndrome, right? We're going to go save people, kind of a missionary syndrome. And I thought, I'll design this program for these poor kids in my neighborhood, and we'll save them, and everyone will be happy. Well, if you've done any community work at all, you know it doesn't really work like that. And some of us white saviors end up crashing into some walls pretty quickly. But fortunately, at a community meeting, I met a principal from a local middle school. His name was Mike Hernandez. He's one of these super principals. And he said, he came to the meeting and he said, I need help. I've got kids at this middle school. The middle school was a mile from Warner Park. He said, I want to start a bunch of after-school clubs for the kids because their parents, they're latchkey kids, the parents are working long hours, and I need help, and I need tutors and mentors. And I sat there and thought, I'm at the university, I'm teaching wonderful undergraduates in environmental studies, I should go talk to this guy. But I'll tell you at first, and this is something about community work, I didn't want to go talk to him. So I thought, I'm going to set up a bird program, and I don't know anything about kids. I don't have any myself. I love them, but I don't know anything about them. So I'm going to work with little kids because I can control them, and they're going to behave really well. And yeah, I know, you're all laughing. See, I don't know anything about kids. And they're going to use the binoculars, and they're going to listen to me reverently and all that. And if I can't get little kids in elementary school, then I want to go to a high school, because they're going to be well behaved too, right? And I thought, middle school, forget it, right? The hormones are off the charts. Middle school to me was like, no way, that sounds crazy. But this principal was from a middle school, and he was asking for help. And so when you're doing community work, it's not about you, right? It's not about what you want to do. It's what the community needs. And that's something I learned in Central America from working with Javier. So I thought, okay, middle school, I'm a little nervous about this, but I'm going to try this. So I created a new course at UW-Madison for undergraduates. It was called Birding to Change the World. And I taught this course. I'm teaching it now in Vermont. I'm setting up the program there. It's still taught at UW-Madison. It's in its 5th year. I taught it in the mornings. I taught birding to my college students from 7:30 to 9:30. The campus is very beautiful, and there are a lot of birds. And so we went outside and learned about birds and learned about kids. And then this was Wednesday mornings. Then Wednesday afternoon at 2:30, we went to the middle school all together. And I paired each college student with a kid for the whole semester in a enviro-mentoring relationship. At first it was called Bird Buddies, but if you know anything about middle school, that's about the most uncool name anyone's ever heard in middle school. So Bird Buddies didn't last very long, and it became Nature Explorers instead. And so then what we would do is leave Sherman Middle School on foot and walk a mile to Warner Park, this place that I showed you. And we'd spend 2 hours there learning and playing together, and then walk back. So the kids got a free walking field trip. The principal wanted, this is what the principal said, they need exercise, they need to be outside, even in the cold, even in January. We had kids walking to Warner Park, 20 degrees, walking a mile, spending 2 hours outside and walking back. Because these kids need to be outside, they're inside all day long sitting at desks. So it was an after-school club. So here's what I thought was going to happen. I thought, as Glenda the Good Witch, I thought, okay, I just took ornithology. I'll just do an ornithology light. It won't be exactly like a college class, but I'll have them. So this is Sled Hill in Warner Park, and we would come in, all the children and college students. The kids loved this place because it's high up and you could see everything. And they'd sit down in a circle, and for the first few weeks, I made them sit there for 10 minutes and be quiet. Remember, this is middle school, silent, and listen to the birds. And then we'd have a quiz, and I made them learn the Latin names and the common names, scientific and common. And they had to sit there for about 20 minutes, and it was excruciating. How many of you have worked with middle schoolers? Doesn't this sound crazy to you? Yeah, okay, so they started squirming around, and my college students looked uncomfortable, and finally, but I was determined, I really wanted to do it this way. I thought it was the right way. And so then one day, one Wednesday we came, and I was starting to do my whole thing with quizzes and Latin names, and one of the kids just stood up, and then he lay down at the top of the hill, and he rolled down the hill. And then another kid got up, and pretty soon all the kids were rolling down the hill, and my college students were standing there looking at me like, what do we do now? And so they started rolling down the hill. And so I was holding a clipboard, and I had binoculars and my glasses and my backpack, and I stood there, and I was standing there by myself on top of a very steep learning curve, and all the young people were down at the bottom of the hill staring up at me. So I thought, okay, they're trying to teach me something, and I took off my glasses, took off my backpack, took off my clipboard, put it down, and I rolled down the hill. And the club then changed, and it began to belong to the kids because they had taught me something very important about community work. And I realized that the club had belonged, and this became a tradition, rolling down the hill. And I realized it had become a tradition one day when the Sherman Middle School librarian, Mrs. Someone, I can't remember her name, the kids invited her to come along. They loved the librarian, and so she walked with us a mile to Warner Park. And I was listening to what the kids were saying to her. They were kind of laughing, and they said, Mrs. So-and-so, when we get to Warner Park, if you want to be in our club, you have to roll down Sled Hill. And she looked a little like, what? And but she did it, and the kids loved it. They said, okay, now you can be in our club. And for me, that was a very important learning moment. Human ecologist Jeffrey Lewis calls this a sense of we-ness. Solidarity in community, a form of social cohesion characterized by mutual respect, reciprocity, commitment, connection, and accountability. Jeffrey Lewis is a human ecologist and a colleague at UW-Madison. He's African American. He is from Tuskegee, Alabama, and he specializes in studying why some black boys succeed in school, not why they fail. And he studied schools in Oakland and Los Angeles using video teams to try to see what do the teachers do that's different, and how do they treat the kids, and how they create this culture and this sense of we-ness. And I really like his work a lot. So we changed the club, and instead of having formal teaching, we went to kind of the John Dewey methods of learning by doing, and all kinds of fun activities for the kids, and climbing trees, and doing all kinds of stuff. This is a mentoring pair. This is Travis and Megan. So the mentoring pair would work together for a semester, but sometimes with several college students, actually, I've trained 123 mentors, and about 10% of the students did not want to leave their kids, and so they would repeat this class one semester. One student repeated it 3 times. These are some of the college students and their kids. Sometimes you can't tell who is who. Also, something else I learned about the kids. So I began to visit the middle school once a week. I'd attend a lunch, and I'd just sit, and I'd go from table to table. If you've ever been in a middle school lunch, oh my God, take earphones. It is deafening. You walk into the lunchroom, and the kids are just screaming, and it's so loud, but it's really fun. And so I started doing this once a week just to hear, what are the kids thinking? What do they like? And one day I sat down at a table with a bunch of squirrely little boys, and there was a boy in our club, and he was trying to talk another boy into joining the club. So I was listening very carefully. What is he saying? And so the new boy says, well, why should I come? Well, what do you guys do? What's it like? And he said, the other kid says, it's really cool. They give you a college student. Yeah, I mean, he was like, 11 years old or something. And I sat there and I thought, a college student, not they give you an iPad or they give you, some gadget, a smartphone. They give you a person, right, who listens to you every week and who is your friend. And so then I began to understand the importance of the mentoring relationship, and that this really wasn't about birds, this was about people. And we went back to the origins of the environmental education movement. The child should first see the thing. Liberty Hyde Bailey wrote this in 1903. How many of you have read the book Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv or have heard of it? Okay, well, it's a great book, Last Child in the Woods, and it's Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, and it's about how our children are spending too much time inside and how that's affecting their health. Right? And so this is a movement that's been going on for over 100 years now, the concern to get kids outside. One quick story from the school program with the kids. So the first year of the program, and it's called An Indigo Bunting is Not Blue. The first year of the program, some of the kids, the middle school kids, were interested in nature and birds, but there was one tall, lanky boy, and I'll call him Jeremy, and he didn't seem interested in anything at all. I paired him with an undergrad and English major named John, who was also tall and lanky. They looked kind of like brothers walking to Warner Park together. They walked together week after week, and Jeremy showed up. But he was always the boy doing something very annoying and dangerous, like walking on the frozen lagoon or swinging from the bridge over the ice like a monkey. And his favorite activity, though, was whacking things with a big stick. And I was just trying to keep him from whacking any people with a big stick, right? But he was whacking the trees with a big stick. He did not seem to care about birds at all. Now, at first, my student, John, the undergraduate, was very patient with Jeremy, but he began to get a little frustrated, and he came to see me during office hours. And you have to understand that some of the other students, the college students, they had little kids who were getting up and giving little reports on eagles and red-tailed hawks, right? They were little not angelic, they were middle schoolers, but they were at least engaging, right? But Jeremy wasn't doing anything. And John told me he felt like a failure. And he says, Tricia, I just can't figure out why is he coming here every Wednesday? He's just not interested in anything at all. And so I was sitting with John, and I was feeling his pain, because sometimes as a teacher, you feel like you're failing and you don't know what's going on. And I told John that story about when I was teaching at Auburn University, and I was hired to set up a service learning program, a journalism program, in Lochapoka High School, which is a rural African-American high school about 15 minutes from Auburn. The very first day that I went to that school, Lochapoka High School, to talk to the principal and introduce myself, this is the advice that he gave me. He said, Trish, students don't know how much you know until they know how much you care. That's some of the best teaching advice I've ever had. And so I told this story to John, and I said, look, John, Jeremy is coming for a reason. I think the reason is you, so just hang in there and keep coming. And John did. In fact, at the end of the first semester, I had 13 undergraduates in that first class, 15, I'm sorry. John was one of 3 who came to me and said, you know what? I don't want to leave my kid. Can I repeat your class? God, this never happens, only if they fail, but okay. So I let them repeat. Now, I'd like to report that second semester in the winter, that Jeremy was so touched by John's devotion that he began to change and he began to pay attention and look at birds. But this did not happen, all right? The pair sloshed through the winter together in the snow and in the ice, with John still trying to keep Jeremy from hitting anyone else or hurting himself. Then one day in the spring, I was at the middle school between lunches, and I was lingering in the hallway doing ethnography, reading the bulletin boards. And the hallway in Sherman Middle School is full of framed photographs, lauding the kids' accomplishments. It's a great school. One bulletin board said, dedicated to school leaders. And there, much to my surprise, was a photo of our Jeremy, of this boy, right? So I walked up there, and what is he doing on there? And on the bulletin board, each student leader had to answer this question. What is the most important thing that happened to you this year? So needless to say, I was quite stunned, and I realized we really had no idea what was going on with some of these kids, why they behaved the way they did. It was a very humbling moment for me, and of course I shared it with John. This is John Robinson. He is the author of Encouraging People of Color to Become Bird Watchers. He's one of the few African American ornithologists in the United States. We brought him to Madison. I use his book as my textbook. He's an amazing birder. And I wanted the kids to see him as a role model. Now, when he agreed to come and we raised the money to bring him, because he is a well-known author, the newspaper, the local newspaper, decided to cover this event. And I thought, oh, this is really important. This is going to help the kids in the bird club. I need a student, a kid, to really impress him in front of the press. And so I gathered the kids together and I said, look, this famous guy's coming. He's going to help us find birds in the park. We were trying to find species number 100. Okay, that was the goal. And I said to the kids, I said, I need a volunteer. Who will give a bird report and impress this guy? And whose hand shoots up? Jeremy. I thought, oh my God, what is this kid going to say in front of the press, right? And I was astonished, and so was John, the college student. We both looked at each other because we knew Jeremy doesn't know anything about birds. Is he going to make this stuff up? But I couldn't say no, right? So a week later, there stood Jeremy in front of a large group and a reporter taking notes with a camera, clutching 2 handwritten notebook pages. John stood beside him. I have a photo of this, but I don't put it on here because I don't disclose Jeremy's identity. And with a quivering voice, the pages shaking like this, Jeremy announced, I'm going to outdo everyone who came before me. Yes, he did in fact say this. I'm not making it up. And then he did. He read all these amazing facts about birds, and I just was completely astonished. Of course, after he finished, the reporter made a beeline for him, didn't want to talk to me, didn't want to talk to any of the other kids, just wanted to talk to Jeremy and followed him around for the rest of the day. So the next morning, here is what I read in the Capital Times of Madison. It's pretty cool when we find a new kind of bird. I'd say my favorite is the Indigo Bunting because their feathers are actually black. But because of the diffraction of light through their feathers, we see them as this amazing shade of blue. Now, I said to myself, first of all, as I stood there reading my newspaper in the driveway, when has this kid ever seen an Indigo Bunting, and how does he know what it is? And the quote was really right out of an ornithology textbook. And I thought, what is going on here? Clearly, I have no idea what I'm doing because he seemed the least likely to want to learn about birds. So I went to John and I showed it to him. I said, John, could you ask him what is going on? And this is the story that Jeremy told John. He said 1 month earlier he had done something, quote, very bad. And he was grounded as punishment for the entire month, except he was allowed to come to bird club. That was the only thing. He told John he became very, very bored, so bored that one day he picked up this bird field guide that John had given him for our club. And he started reading it. And he was so fascinated that he read it a second time, and he highlighted all the stuff that he really loved. And this was the thing that he loved the most. The Indigo Bunting's ability to transform sunlight into color was one of those facts that leapt off the page and just grabbed him. So a year later, after Jeremy graduated and went to high school and John graduated, I got an email from John. He was in San Francisco and he was looking for a job. He was an English major. He'd been kind of lost. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He told me, I called him on the phone, we talked, and he said that he had decided because of this experience that he wanted to be a lawyer and work for justice. And he wanted to know, could I be a reference, because he was applying for an internship at a law firm. And I said, sure, of course I will. And I was delighted. Soon after that, I got a call from this very prestigious law firm in San Francisco. It was an Irish woman calling me, and of course, because I'm Irish American, we chatted it up for a while. I was trying to grease the wheel, trying to get John the job. And she said, look, she said, we've had 200 applicants for this job. And she said, the thing that jumped out, that really stood out, he told this story about a boy who was really difficult and that he didn't give up and he stuck with him. She said, is this, and the boy's mother died and all this stuff. She said, is this story true? And I said, yes. And she said, well, that's what really stood out about him compared to the other applicants. She said, and I think we're going to give him the job, and they did. So this is a quote from Javier, my Jesuit mentor. Cambridge helped shape my university career, but it barely touched my heart. Big universities run the risk of desensitizing their students to suffering and injustice because of the predominance of a magnified but narrow rationality. He wrote that a year before he died. And so this program is designed to touch students' hearts. And I think that here at small colleges like Spring Hill, you get the experience to really get to know your professors, to do work with them, to do things in the community. And that's a very different kind of transformative educational experience that I'm very dedicated to. So this is the impact this program had on college students. Many of my students, the 123 mentors, got jobs in AmeriCorps, Teach for America, the Peace Corps, public schools, church outreach, nature centers, and children's museums. One of my students became the director of the Four Lakes Wildlife Center in Madison, Wisconsin, which does wildlife rehab. She's an amazing person. Another student runs the Madison Audubon Goose Pond Sanctuary. Another became a coordinator of a school garden project. So students got all kinds of jobs because of this. It also had a tremendous community impact because Warner Park, as I showed you before, some of the statistics and the crime, and it had a reputation as a troubled place in Madison. And because now for 5 years, every Wednesday, neighbors see this huge growing, started with 6 kids the first week, there were 101 4 years later in September that registered, and over half of the kids are Black or Latino, and a lot of white kids too, all thrown together. And these kids are going down the street in a big herd, wearing binoculars and looking at birds and jumping in people's leaf piles and throwing snowballs at each other. And so it's given the neighborhood a different reputation, and it's kind of started to change the way people see their place. Here's some quotes from college students about the program. After the last day, I was surprised at how sad I felt. When I got home, I felt sort of depressed that our class and nature club was over and there would be no more morning bird walks. I guess it meant that I was actually going to miss the class, nature club, and the kids. I have never had a class like this before because usually I'm just glad when they are finally over. This environmental studies capstone was more of an experience rather than a class. And that allowed me to learn more about myself, my classmates, and of course, our co-explorers. That was one of my students as he was graduating wrote that. It's a quote in my dissertation. Co-explorers means the kids. So the final lesson I'll end with so we can go to questions is find your flock. If you're looking for your path, It's not an individual path. Find something that you love and find it with friends. And if you find something you love and that's important and can make a difference in the world, your flock will be there. The people will be doing the things that you're doing and that you love, right? And I'm sure some of you are already experiencing this in your service learning programs. So I'm going to end with that, and then we'll go to questions. Thank you.